Welcome to the first Cheap Audio Man podcast. You can watch it here on YouTube or on Spotify podcasts or other podcasts like Apple stuff. We're going to figure it all out. There'll be links in the description. This is going to be me reading a script that I did not write. This is written by Valentina Bernal, my wonderful channel manager / writer / editor / calendar wrangler, all that stuff. Today is Ozzy Osborne. Remember, like and subscribe. You can be the first subscriber to the Cheap Audio Man music podcast. Anyway. When you go to a concert, you expect the usual things. Loud music, overpriced beer, maybe somebody spilling it on your shoes, the overpriced beer, which happens a lot, and stuff that smells funny. If things get a little on the wild side, you could see a somewhat violent circle, or maybe the singer tries to crowd surf. Valentina, it's mostly people trying to crowd surf, not the singer. What you don't expect is the singer suddenly biting the head off of a live bat, unless, of course, well, the singer is Ozzy Osborne. Now, depending upon who you ask, that moment is either the height of rock and roll insanity or the dumbest thing anyone's ever done on stage. The truth is, it was an accident. Really? He thought the bat was a toy. Spoiler, it wasn't. Maybe when it moved around, that should have been his first clue. He got a mouthful of fur, had to go straight to the hospital for a rabies shot, and later described the taste as rusty Vaseline. Delicious. That's Ozzy in a nutshell. The myth, the madness, and sometimes the mistake that becomes legend. But behind the headlines, Ozzy Osbourne was something else entirely. The unlikely father of heavy metal. I have a book, I don't know where it's at, called The History of Heavy Metal. Heavy metal as a genre did not exist before Black Sabbath. There was metal-like or proto-metal, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple. A lot of that stuff, Jimi Hendrix, was prior to metal. Even though the term heavy metal is rumored to be because a journalist, that's what it is, a journalist commented after one of Jimi Hendrix's performance, that it was heavy metal. So maybe the term started with Jimi Hendrix, but the genre started with Black Sabbath. John Michael Osborne was born on December 3rd, 1948, in Marston Green Hospital. His home was Aston in working-class Birmingham, England. His parents, John Thomas, Jack Osborne, hey, look at that, Jack Osborne, and Lillian Osborne, were working in a post-war Britain trying to raise their 6 children. John Michael was the 4th child and the first boy in the family. Both parents worked full-time jobs. Jack, his dad, was a toolmaker, working long nights at the General Electric plant, while Lillian worked days at a Lucas factory making car parts. Look at that. The whole family lived at 14 Lodge Road, a small 2-bedroom home where John would form one of his first memories. On June 2nd, 1953, Queen Elizabeth II is crowned. The ceremony televised and seen all over Britain. John was only 4 at the time. His father Jack and Aunt Violet were involved in the neighborhood celebrations. Both had created costumes to perform as Al Jolson. The American entertainer was famous. I'm going to say it. The American entertainer was famous for his blackface. Minstrel. I don't know what that. Minstrel act? I guess act. In Britain, it was simply part of mainstream entertainment. Times have changed. The man was a prolific artist and well known in Britain by his films, like The Jazz Singer in 1927. It was the first talkie movie. Radio stations broadcast Swanee and April Showers. often leading many amateur performers to copy his act. Although unfortunate and inappropriate by our standards, it was so ubiquitous back then that Jack, as one of the amateur performers, he dressed up in blackface to be part of the celebration. Whoopsies. When John saw him, he was terrified. So much so that it became his first clear memory. Wow. I don't really know how to really react to that. Apparently, Ozzy Osbourne's first clear memory was when he was doing something inappropriate. John was already a quiet and insecure kid. He had shown symptoms of ADHD and dyslexia. However, both remained undiagnosed until later in life, leaving John with the label of slow and thick, as he wrote in his biography. He often struggled to fit in with other kids. Around 7 or 8 years old, they started twisting his last name. At first, it was simply based on John's last name, Osborne, which transformed into Ozzy. He hated being called Ozzy. Other kids still chanted the nickname as a taunt. But sometimes it's best to make the best out of a bad situation. He took the nickname for himself, although it didn't stop the bullying. Ozzy later stopped responding to John altogether, only answering to Ozzy. He made the nickname his, taking some control back. But the bullying only got worse. Teachers who were meant to help and protect him became physically violent, beating and humiliating Ozzy with all sorts of things like rulers, canes, and even shoes. Well, that's just kind of how it was back then when you went to school and the teachers beat you with different objects. Things only escalated. When he was 11, 2 older boys crossed a line. Jeez, they sexually abused him? Ozzy didn't tell anyone, afraid of the consequences. Good gravy. Ugh. It's new to me. Why would he remain quiet? I don't know, because it's embarrassing and it was back then. At home, his family wasn't physically abusive, but they were very strict. They had to be. Life in a working class family had no space for mistakes or missteps. He left school at 16, something perfectly normal in Birmingham at the time, and tattooed the letters OZZY on his knuckles. He used what he had available, a needle and a graphite pencil lead. This strictness led his father to refuse paying a fine after he was arrested for burglary. It was 40 pounds. Ozzy himself couldn't pay, and even if his family helped, it was more than they could come up with. He was sentenced with 3 months in Winson Green Prison. What landed him there? Ozzy had started stealing random things from a clothing shop. Baby bibs, toddler underpants, and a heavy TV. I wasn't ready for the third one. I'm like, okay. Bibs, underpants, television. He wasn't recognized during the burglary itself, but one of his gloves had a missing finger, and the fingerprint linked him to the crime. He was released after 6 weeks for good behavior, but the experience left him scarred, at least when stealing. Other problems would become a more common theme in his life. Good gravy. All right, kind of paints a bit of a picture. Obviously, working class family, performer. First memory was him doing something very inappropriate. His teachers beat him. To be fair, teachers beat a lot of people back then. Got abused, which is terrible, and started stealing random things from a clothing shop, like baby bibs, toddler underpants, and a heavy TV. Just after being released, apparently from prison or jail, the Beatles were performing John Lennon's last show. At the same time, Ozzy had to cut ties with one of his only friends, Pat. He had escalated his involvement with drugs, and after experiencing prison, Ozzy wanted to avoid returning as much as he could. He then started a string of odd jobs. He lasted 1 week as a plumber's apprentice. After that, his mother got him a job at the Lucas factory, but he was also fired when he was found passed out for inhaling degreasing fumes. During his job, he met Harry, Harry had worked there for 29 years, 7 months, and it seemed like his only aspiration was a gold watch he could get after completing 30 years with the company. He only had 5 more months. Ozzy was disheartened and decided that this couldn't be his own future. The job that stuck the longest was at the slaughterhouse in Digbeth. There, Ozzy had terrible roles, only referred to as puke remover. He himself threw up at the job for 4 weeks. Cow killer, tripe hanger, pig stunner, and heel puller. The positive aspect of the job, at least for Ozzy, was that he could easily steal cow eyes, which he later dropped in people's drinks at the local pub. He was a jokester, wasn't he? Ozzy worked at the slaughterhouse for about 1.5 years. He hated it, but he kept showing up because at least it was money in his pocket. The job was grim. He described the smell of blood and guts sticking to his clothes, following him home at night. It was during these years that music became more than just an escape. He would spend what he earned on records, going to pubs, and dreaming about something bigger than factory floors or killing cows for a living. Oof. Cow eyes and drinks. How would you like to, would you like to pick up your scotch and soda or your whiskey and water and there'd be a giant cow's eye, maybe with a little bit of optical nerve connected to it? Wow. I would imagine that Ozzy's time in the slaughterhouse, killing cows, putting their eyeballs in people's drinks, killing pigs, cleaning up puke, maybe influenced his music. Ozzy's life started to change when he bumped into an old schoolmate, Tony Iommi. Tony Iommi, who was already known around Aston as an incredible guitarist. Iommi had his own struggles too. He had lost the tips of his fingers in a factory accident, which led him to invent a new way of playing adapted to himself. That accident gave him a sound that was heavier and darker than anything else at the time. Practically unique to him. Interesting. Together with bassist Geezer Butler and drummer Bill Ward, they put together a band. At first they called themselves Rare Breed, then Earth, until finally landed on the name Black Sabbath. The name came from a 1963 Italian horror film, I Tre Volti della Para, The Three Faces of Fear. The release title in English was, you guessed it, Black Sabbath. It fit their sound perfectly. The thought behind the name change was essentially, if people pay to be scared by horror movies, maybe they'll pay for scary music. They were right. Black Sabbath wasn't very good. That's funny. But for Ozzy, it was a start. His first real show was at a fire station Christmas party. Fantastic. Nothing says Merry Christmas like heavy metal music with occult themes. From the first moment he caught sight of the crowd, he froze up completely. The stage fright hit him so hard, he could barely get through the songs. That fear really never went away. It followed him through Sabbath and even into his solo career. They all rehearsed constantly and played in clubs where the crowds were drunk, rowdy, and sometimes violent. Ozzy was still dealing with stage fright, but Tony encouraged him to lean into his weirdness. That strange, high-pitched, haunted voice became the centerpiece of the band. In Hamburg, during residency at the Star Club, Ozzy started experimenting with the kind of antics that would later make him infamous. Their manager, Jim Simpson, encouraged him to let loose, to act strange and unpredictable, to overcome his fear. Who is this Jim? Well, he was a jazz musician. But most importantly, he owned a club in Birmingham, Henry's Blues House. He had booked them since they were Earth and became their first actual manager. He even got their first record deal with Philips Vertigo, which was recorded in just 12 hours. Then he shoved them all in an old battered van and sent them away to their first European tour. Their first record was described as raw and ominous, opening with thunder and a tolling bell before crashing into Tony's riffs and Ozzy's chilling vocals. Very dramatic and unusual. No one had ever heard anything like it. Critics dismissed it, but young listeners connected immediately. Finally, something different. Against all predictions, the album went top 10 in the UK, and the follow-up, Paranoid, got them their first taste of fame in America. Songs like War Pigs and Iron Man made them international stars almost overnight. For the first time, Ozzy had real money, recognition, and the sense of belonging. Stark contrast from his childhood and teen years. But success always has strings attached. When she said stark contrast, I thought about Tony Stark, because Tony Stark wore a Black Sabbath t-shirt. And, well, Iron Man. Well, the band started drinking heavily. In England, pints after rehearsal weren't unusual, but for Sabbath, it snowballed into something much bigger. Touring money turned into bottles of booze. Bottles turned into pills, and soon there were mountains of cocaine. It wasn't glamorous, but it wasn't exactly clever. Still, it was the life of a rock star. Slowly, using that white substance and drinking became worse. Ozzy would stay up for days at a time, rambling, singing, or just staring off into space. I can relate to that. He once said he didn't even know how he stayed alive in the 70s. For them, it was fuel and escape at the same time. With their systems loaded, the music got darker. Their friendly relationship was straining. They still worked together and played pranks on each other like they used to, but they were now bordering on cruel and violent. Ozzy was both the clown and the heart of the group, loved by fans, but he was increasingly difficult for his bandmates to handle. By the mid-70s, the band was really coming apart at the seams. The endless touring wore them down, city after city, night after night. They were rich and they were famous, but also exhausted, somewhat delirious, and, ironically, paranoid. Arguments over money turned into arguments over music. Tony Iommi wanted to take the band in new directions, trying different sounds and cleaner production. Ozzy wasn't interested. He wanted the heavy riffs, the doom and gloom that had made them famous. Add to that drugs and increasing pressure. Cocaine wasn't just a habit anymore, it was the engine for their daily lives. Some days, rehearsals barely happened at all. They were supposed to be working on albums, but instead they were working on staying alive. Friendships that had carried them out of Aston were crumbling under the weight of fame and addiction. Ozzy left once, came back, and then in 1979, Tony Iommi finally sent drummer Bill Ward to fire him for good. For Ozzy, it was betrayal. Ozzy couldn't understand why he was getting the boot. In his mind, they were all equally wrecked. They all drank, they all snorted, they all lost days to the haze, but reality was slightly different. The others, for all their excess, still managed to write songs, still made it to rehearsals, still kept the machine moving. Ozzy was falling off the edge. He missed rehearsals. When he did show up, he was too out of it to sing, and from the outside it was clear the band couldn't go on with him in it. Out of the band, Ozzy had nothing left. No money, no directions, no friends to pull him out of the hole. He was in America at the time, so he checked into La Park Hotel in Los Angeles. Not for a week or two, but for months. The room became his new prison cell. Curtains down, bottles scattered, trays of food piling up. Sounds like my room. He barely left the bed except to drink more, to take more of whatever he was. He barely left the bed except to drink more, to take more of whatever he could to avoid the awful withdrawal. He later admitted he thought his career was finished. Black Sabbath had carried him out of Aston and into the world. Without them, what was left? He wasn't writing. He wasn't rehearsing. He wasn't even sober enough to think about the future. That could easily have been the end of the story, but Ozzy wasn't invisible, not to record labels. He was still on the books of Jet Records, the label run by Dan Arden. Arden had managed Black Sabbath for a time and was infamous in the industry for his ruthless style. But his daughter Sharon was working as his receptionist and assistant, and she understood more about the business than her father imagined. She knew who Ozzy was. She knew the band had fired him, and she knew he was self-destructing in that hotel room. She could have left it at that. Plenty of managers would have, and many did at the time. But something about Ozzy drew her in. She believed there was still a career waiting if he could be pulled out of the fog. So she offered to manage him herself. At first, Ozzy didn't take it seriously. Why would anyone believe in him now? He's at the lowest point he's ever been and way higher than he cares to be. But Sharon wasn't asking. She was determined to prove he wasn't finished. Wow, I did not know that. Sharon was the manager's daughter and the receptionist and assistant. So she saved Ozzy and his career, apparently. With Sharon in his corner, Ozzy started crawling out of the wreckage. The first step was finding a band. That meant many auditions. At first it was chaos. Musicians came and went. None of them the right fit for the new solo career. But then came a young guitarist from California who was barely out of his teens, but with impressive talent. He was Randy Rhoads. Ozzy always said meeting Randy was like being struck by lightning. The kid walked in, plugged in a tiny practice amp, and played scales to warm up. Ozzy thought the audition hadn't even started yet, but he was already floored, and the kid had barely finished his little practice before the true audition. He later admitted he had tears in his eyes just from hearing Randy play. That was because Randy was a different type of guitarist. He had classical training and blended that with heavy riffs. It gave Ozzy's new music a sound that felt fresh but still powerful. Along with bassist Bob Daisley and drummer Lee Kerslake, they started recording at Ridge Farm Studios. What came out was A Blizzard of Oz, released in 1980. The album hit like a thunderclap. The songs carried all the heaviness Ozzy was known for, but sharper, more melodic, more precise. Blizzard was already good, but Crazy Train became an anthem. With its unmistakable opening riff, Mr. Crowley showed off Randy's neoclassical solos. The record went multi-platinum and launched Ozzy straight back into the spotlight. For critics and fans who had written him off as a washed-up addict, this was proof. Ozzy Osbourne wasn't finished. If anything, he was just beginning the second act. It gave me the goosebumps. All the chills. Wow. Very cool. I know this record. I've listened to this record a bunch, but I'm going to listen to it a lot more. Crazy Train. Mr. Crowley. The success of Blizzard of Oz gave Ozzy momentum he hadn't felt in years. He followed it quickly with Diary of a Madman in 1981. And it proved that Blizzard wasn't a fluke. Songs like Flying High Again showed Ozzy still had his strange mix of menace and humor, while Randy's guitar work was on another level. Everyone in the industry agreed Ozzy's comeback was real. But the chaos hadn't left him, not really. Touring was wild, and Ozzy's behavior stayed just as unpredictable as it was back then. In 1981, Sharon arranged a meeting with CBS Records. This was supposed to be his moment to show the executives that he was serious, professional, that he could be a reliable artist worth investing in. The suits were sitting around the conference table, waiting for Ozzy to make his entrance. He didn't just want to walk in and make a statement. He came with a plan. In his pocket, he carried 2 white doves. The idea was simple. Halfway through the meeting, he'd find a quiet moment, and then he'd let them fly around the room as a peace offering. something poetic, symbolic, something memorable. I don't know if you didn't think about maybe the birds crapping on the conference room table. Anyway, it went much worse than that. At least that was the plan. Real life took a different path. Ozzy sat there trying to listen, but restless, fidgeting, not paying attention to the executive's polished business talk. Bored, he put his hand in his pocket, gently grabbed one of the doves, pulled it out from his coat, and instead of releasing it like he had planned, he looked at it, tilted his head, and without a word, bit its head clean off. Blood sprayed on his shirt. The bird's body twitched in his hand. The room erupted in horror. People screamed, jumped back from the table, and scrambled for the door. Sharon was mortified. She had set this whole thing up to present Ozzy as a professional. And now there was a dead bird staining the carpet. Ozzy just shrugged. Supposed to be a peace offering, he said. The dove story spread fast. But it was nothing compared to what would come next. January 20th, 1982, Des Moines, Iowa. I had no idea it was in Des Moines. Ozzy was in the middle of a packed show when something unexpected landed on the stage. At first glance, it looked like a toy. A fan had thrown what Ozzy thought was a rubber bat, or maybe a stuffed animal. Things like that happened all of the time. Fans tossed weird props on stage, and Ozzy, always looking for a laugh, picked them up. He held the creature up, looked at the crowd, and then, in a move that seemed perfectly in character for the Prince of Darkness, he bit its head off. Again. Except it was bat. Instantly, he knew something was wrong. The toy moved. Tiny bones crunched in his mouth. He had a mouthful of fur. The bat's head and blood. The audience roared, thinking it was all part of the act. Maybe a bit extreme, but it was an Ozzy Osborne concert after all. When he realized what had just happened, he froze and spat it out. Later, he said the taste was like rusty Vaseline. We all know what that tastes like. The show had stopped. Ozzy was rushed to the hospital, and for good reason. No one is supposed to touch bats, much less bite the head off of one, given how many diseases they carry. The doctors gave him multiple rabies shots, mainly as a precaution. For weeks, though, the story dominated headlines. Parents' groups were horrified, fans were divided, and Ozzy's reputation as the Prince of Darkness was carved into stone. What made it all the more absurd was that it wasn't even on purpose. He really thought it was fake, but in rock history, the truth doesn't always matter. The legend does. I would assume that maybe, depending upon what type of pre-show ritual Ozzy had, and I would assume that maybe it wasn't always the most healthy. It probably wasn't tilapia and broccoli. Anyway, I don't know how reasonable Ozzy was when that bat landed on the stage. Maybe he was. Maybe he was completely sober. The bat had sealed Ozzy's reputation. Overnight, he went from comeback rocker to full-blown satanic legend of chaos. Ooh, very good, Valentina. Satanic legend of chaos. Newspapers couldn't get enough of it, and fans now expected the unexpected every time he stepped on stage. But fame like that has a cruel way of twisting on itself. Just as Ozzy was becoming larger than life, reality hit him with something that cut far deeper than any headline. In March of 1982, the tour stopped in Leesburg, Florida. The band parked their buses near a private mansion with a small airfield, both property of the tour bus company. They were planning just a short rest. I feel like this is going to go bad quickly. Parked beside them was a little Beechcraft Bonanza plane, also owned by the same company. The bus driver, Andrew Aycock, also happened to be a licensed pilot, although not authorized to carry passengers, at least on paper. Like many artists and roadies, he'd been drinking, and later tests showed he had white powder in his system. Still, he decided to take the little plane parked beside them out for a spin. At first it seemed harmless. It always does. The man seemed to know what he was doing. They always do. It was a short joyride to pass the time. The band's seamstress, Rachel Youngblood, went with him. Then Randy Rhoads agreed to join. Randy was terrified of flying, but friends said he only climbed aboard to take some aerial photos. Hey, I'm super scared of flying. Why don't I get into this small aircraft with the band's seamstress, which I didn't know was a thing, and ride around with a roadie that's under the influence and can barely fly a plane because he's not supposed to carry passengers. What could possibly go wrong? The buses were parked below, and that's where the trouble started. Aycock thought it would be funny to buzz them, swooping low, close enough to the bus roof to scare the band awake. On the first pass, they skimmed the roof, but on the second, the wing clipped Ozzy's bus. The plane tilted and spun out of control. In seconds, it was a fireball smashed into the garage of the nearby mansion. The little plane exploded. All three on board were killed instantly. Ozzy was inside the bus when the wing hit. He woke up to the impact, then looked outside and saw the fireball from the window. Randy was gone. The kid was only 25. Ozzy was shattered. Randy was his guitarist. But he was also family. Their connection had been instant, like lightning. And in only a couple of years, Randy had reshaped the sound of Ozzy's music and his whole career. Now he was gone, and it felt senseless. At the funeral in Burbank, Ozzy stood shoulder to shoulder with others, carrying Randy's coffin. The weight of it was crushing, but not just because of the wood and metal. Ozzy later admitted he didn't know how to carry himself anymore. He was lost, drifting, and for a while, he wasn't sure he wanted to go on at all. The weeks after the crash were a blur of grief, depression, drinking, and silence. Ozzy would sit for hours, staring, replaying the what-ifs in his head. If Randy hadn't gotten on the plane, if the bus had been parked somewhere else, if anyone had said no. But the man who had just reinvented himself with Blizzard of Oz now looked like he might really vanish completely. Sharon refused to let that happen. Where Ozzy collapsed, she took control. She managed the phone calls, the press, the business, the endless logistics that came with death, public life, and touring. More than that, she made sure he didn't crawl back into the hole he had been at in La Park Hotel. Sharon pushed him back onto the stage, back into the studio, keeping the machine alive when Ozzy couldn't. She was relentless, and Ozzy later admitted that without her drive, he would have disappeared right then. The alcohol, the depression, the fog. Sharon saw it all. She wasn't just his manager anymore. Their relationship had grown into something much deeper. On July 4th, 1982, Sharon and Ozzy married in Maui, Hawaii. Ozzy later joked that the fireworks on the 4th of July were just for them. She had been at his side during his darkest days, and now she was officially his partner in life, as well as in business. Not long after the wedding, their family began to grow. In September of 1983, Sharon gave birth to their first daughter, Amy. A year later came Kelly, and by 1985, their son Jack arrived. All three were born in London, though the family moved often between the UK and the States as Ozzy's career demanded. For a man who once thought he wouldn't make it out of Aston, holding his own kids was surreal. He was never shy about admitting he wasn't the world's most reliable dad. His addictions, his music, and the touring pulled him away too often. But in quieter moments, he said fatherhood scared him more than any stage. He joked that he could face a stadium of screaming fans, but not a crying baby at 3 a.m. Sharon was the anchor. She balanced Ozzy's career. She raised the children, and she kept the family together, even as the chaos of Ozzy's life kept circling. After Randy's death, Sharon's push worked, but it wasn't like Ozzy suddenly snapped back into form. Randy's death was rough. He walked on stage shaky and distracted. often numbing himself with alcohol just to get through the night. Fans cheered, but Ozzy later admitted he barely remembered some of these performances. It wasn't that grief went away, it was that grief got buried under the drinking. The band around him was now in constant motion. Guitarists came and went in quick succession. Bernie Torme stepped in almost immediately, but only lasted a handful of shows before leaving. Then came Brad Gillis from Night Ranger, a solid player, but more of a temporary stand-in than a long-term partner. None of them felt right. Ozzy wasn't looking for someone to copy Randy. That was impossible. But it was also impossible not to compare people to Randy, because Randy was a creative partner, a spark that lifted Ozzy out of despair. And now, every new player felt like a reminder of what had been lost. It wasn't until Jake E. Lee arrived that things began to steady. Jake was young, fearless, and incredibly gifted, but most importantly, he didn't try to be Randy. He brought his own style, sharp riffs, and flashy solos that sounded fresh instead of borrowed. For the first time since the crash, Ozzy could try to stop looking backward and start thinking forward. With Jake on guitar, bassist Bob Daisley, and drummer Tommy Aldridge, Ozzy made his next move. In 1983, he released Bark at the Moon. It was his first record without Randy, and you could feel the weight of it in every track. The title song roared with Jake's riffs, while Ozzy's haunting vocals pushed the whole thing into darker territory. The title song roared with Jake's riffs, while Ozzy's haunting vocals pushed the whole thing into darker territory. The sadness and weight poured from the speakers. On MTV, the music video was unforgettable. Ozzy transformed into a werewolf and stumbled through graveyards, looking like he had stepped straight out of a horror movie. For a generation of kids glued to cable TV, this was their first glimpse at the Prince of Darkness. The album went gold within weeks and eventually platinum. Critics were split, some calling it cartoonish, others praising its energy. But fans didn't care. They connected. Bark at the Moon proved Ozzy wasn't just surviving Randy's loss. He was growing, as painful as it was. Still behind the scenes, he was drinking heavily, arguing with his bandmates, and leaning harder on Sharon to keep everything together. But for the public, Bark at the Moon cemented something important. Ozzy wasn't going away. If anything, he was digging in deeper. Bark at the Moon kept Ozzy moving, but it didn't fix him. The road was still a circus. In 1983, he toured the States and Europe with Jake on guitar. The stories from that period sound like tall tales. Until you remember who we're talking about. There's the night in Memphis, when Ozzy woke up on the central divider of a 12-lane freeway. He was barefoot, confused, and desperate to pee. I think that's going to come back here later. He saw some parked cars and picked a tire that seemed private enough, and it belonged to an unmarked police car. They arrested him on the spot. The music rolled on anyway. New songs, new tours, but the same old habits. On the road, Ozzy tried to keep the fire burning. In 1984, 1985, he toured and kept making headlines. Black Sabbath reunited for Live Aid in 1985 with the original four back on stage for a brief set. It was a reminder of where it all began. But it didn't change Ozzy's path. He was committed to his solo career now. He was also committed, or at least stuck, in the lifestyle that went with it. By 1983 and 1984, he was sharing stages and hotel quarters with Motley Crue. That particular tour was notorious for a reason. Everyone was drinking. Everyone was getting into trouble. The rules were simple. There were none. Ozzy could be the life of the party one night and a ghost the next. He crossed lines because the lines didn't feel real anymore. The music never stopped despite the situation. After Bark at the Moon came new sessions, new tours, more late nights. Guitarists changed again. Jake E. Lee didn't stay forever. There were fights over money. Imagine that. There were managers and lawyers in rooms Ozzy didn't want to be in. He lived for the stage and, unfortunately, for whatever bottle was the closest. As always, Sharon kept the business going. She handled venues, budgets, press, damage control, while Ozzy just kept being Ozzy. Then a different kind of trouble knocked on the door. In 1986, a family who had lost their son to suicide blamed Ozzy's song, Suicide Solution, for the tragedy. They insisted it encouraged self-harm and had mysterious hidden messages. Ozzy and his team argued the song was about the danger of alcohol abuse, not a call to end anyone's life. The case dragged him through court and the press. In the end, the lawsuit was thrown out. Freedom of speech. The judge said the content might be offensive, even repulsive, but that didn't make it illegal. Ozzy walked away legally clean. The Prince of Darkness label is fun when it's bats and doves. It's a bit different when real grief and lawyers are in the room. Ugh, man. I remember that Suicide Solution being a thing. I don't know if it didn't happen yet, but he peed on the Alamo. I wonder if that's going to be next. But that would be ironic or coincidental, I guess, that he got arrested in Memphis for peeing on an unmarked police car, and then in San Antonio for peeing on a monument. I think he's still banned from San Antonio. I don't know. Well, I guess it doesn't matter now, does it? As if American courts weren't enough, the chaos reached home. In September of 1989, Ozzy woke up in a jail cell in Birminghamshire with no idea how he got there. His memory was completely blank. It's called a blackout. He asked the guards, what happened? However, with the non-existent warmth and tact of many policemen, they told him. They were pretty frank with him. The night before, he tried to strangle Sharon. The reality sank in slowly. Sharon had managed to fight him off and called the police. Their children had been in the house the whole time. For Ozzy, it was the lowest pit he had ever fallen into, and he didn't even remember how. The headlines had always made him sound dangerous, but this was different. This wasn't bats or doves or drunken pranks or even drugs. This was his family. He was charged and held for over a day before being released on bail. In court, Sharon testified against him, but she also asked the judge to send him to treatment instead of prison. Ozzy later said it was the moment he finally understood he couldn't keep living the way he had been. Fortunately, the court agreed. He was ordered into rehab. Not the revolving door kind of rehab rock stars sometimes do, but real, thorough treatment. In early 1990, he went to Hazelden in Minnesota, one of the toughest rehabs in the U.S., treatment centers in the U.S. He spent weeks there detoxing, sitting in group sessions, and finally confronting just how much damage he had done, not only to his career, but to the people closest to him. Sobriety didn't turn him into a saint. He never was. But it gave him a little perspective to see his life clearly. He did the math on the years of drinking and drugs and believed he had burned through millions. He also realized he was lucky to be alive at all. Sharon stayed. The marriage was bruised and battered, but it didn't break. The 1990s opened with a surprise. Instead of fading out, Ozzy wrote one of his cleanest, most confident records, No More Tears. It hit in 1981 with Zakk Wylde on guitar. The title track was huge. Mama, I'm Coming Home. It showed a softer, more human side without losing the edge. By 1992, Ozzy wasn't just a frontman anymore. He truly understood he was a husband and a dad with 3 little kids at home. Amy was 9, Kelly was 8, Jack was 6. Sharon was running the business and the house at the same time. While Ozzy, he was 43 and feeling every mile he had put on his body. The tour that followed was massive, and it took everything he had. Somewhere in the middle of all that noise, he looked around and realized his children were growing up in the wings. He could hear them backstage sometimes, and then he would be gone for weeks. The old answer was to always push through it. However, with new clarity, he chose something different this time. In 1992, he announced the No More Tours tour. Ozzy said he was retiring from the road and the lights. He wanted to go home, spend time with his family, and try to stay healthy. People rolled their eyes because rock stars retire all the time and then, unretire. But at that moment, he really meant it. The shows felt like goodbyes. He talked to the crowd more. He took longer looks around the arena. At the end of the run, he closed things out in California and brought the past on stage with him. Members of Black Sabbath walked out for a surprise reunion. It was a circle closing. The kid from Aston, who helped start heavy metal, sang farewell with the band that made it possible. Retirement didn't mean silence. He went home to the countryside with Sharon and the kids. New house, fewer late nights, more family dinners. He tried to be present. He tried to be boring. Some days he managed it well enough. Even with sobriety, his life had a way of finding the absurd. There was the time he took a colon cleansing tonic before viewing a house and succumbed to whatever the tonic had. He destroyed the bathroom. Then he looked around and realized there was no toilet paper since this was an empty house. So, with no other option, he used the curtains like a towel. There were also... He used the curtains. There were also some eyebrow pranks on sleeping friends. And then they taught a dog how to drink sherry. Do you really need to teach a dog how to drink sherry? Ozzy was calmer, but not dull. But now, there were school runs and bedtimes mixed in with rehearsals. The balance wasn't perfect. However, it was better than before. Of course, it didn't last forever. A few years later, he was back with a grin and a new banner that said what everyone was thinking anyway. Retirement sucks. But the choice he made in 1992 still mattered. He had stepped off the machine long enough to see his life. Long enough to be a dad while his kids were still small. And when he came back, he didn't come back alone. He brought the family with him. He didn't stay retired. He never could. A few years into so-called retirement, he was restless again, but the music world had changed. Grunge had exploded. New metal bands were on the rise, and when Sharon tried to get Ozzy into Lollapalooza, come on, Randy, Lollapalooza lineup, the promoters were quick to turn him down. They called him a dinosaur. Too old, too out of touch. And Sharon, well, she didn't particularly like that. If they wouldn't book Ozzy, she'd build a festival of their own, all around him. So in 1996, Ozzfest was born. At first, it was just a couple of shows in Arizona and California. Ozzy headlined, and Sharon stacked the bill with younger, more aggressive bands who were building their own followings. It worked. Crowds packed in. Kids in black t-shirts saw their heroes and their new favorites on the same stage. The next year, Ozzfest went nationwide. And in the 2000s, it was a touring juggernaut, one of the biggest rock and metal festivals in the world. It gave bands like Slipknot, System of a Down, Lamb of God, and countless others their first taste of massive audiences. For them, Ozzfest wasn't just a gig, it was validation. If Ozzy Osbourne's festival put you on the bill, you were the real thing. But Ozzy wasn't just the headliner anymore. He was the elder statesman of metal. Aw, I love that. The guy who handed the torch while still holding on to it himself. Fans came to see him, but they also came to discover what was next. And in a strange way, Ozzfest became proof that Ozzy wasn't a dinosaur like the people at Lollapalooza said. He was the bridge. He was the reason heavy metal's past and future could share the same stage. By the end of the decade, nostalgia came back around. Black Sabbath reunited. The original four, Ozzy, Tony, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, all back in a room together after years of lawsuits, insults, and distance. For fans, it was a dream come true. For the band, it was complicated. Rehearsals were tense, sometimes funny, sometimes heartbreaking. The old chemistry was still there, but so were the old wounds. Bill Ward, who had been with Ozzy since the very beginning, struggled the most. His health was, not good. During rehearsals in 1997, he messed up in the middle of a practice. His hand cramped so badly, he had to be rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. At first, Ozzy thought he was joking. Bill had a reputation for pranks, but this time it was real. It was a reminder that they weren't kids in Aston anymore. They were middle-aged men whose bodies had finally taken the hit from decades of touring, drinking, drugs, and everything else. Bill wasn't even 50. However, when they did make it on stage, the years fell away. Playing Paranoid in front of tens of thousands, Ozzy and Tony locking eyes like they were still in the Birmingham rehearsal room, it felt like history folding in on itself. Fans screamed themselves hoarse just to see the four of them together again. For Ozzy, it was the best of both worlds. He could be the solo icon with Sharon and Ozfest, and then step back into Sabbath and remind everyone where it all began. He liked having both. One night he was the Prince of Darkness in his own right. The next he was the voice of the band that started heavy metal. It gave him balance. If you could call anything in Ozzy's life balanced. Yeah. I just think that's funny. Oh. Television executives recognized that Ozzy Osborne attracted strange mishaps and situations. And in 2002, the Osbournes hit MTV and turned the family into household names. Cameras in the kitchen, cameras by the pool, Sharon managing, Ozzy shuffling through the house in slippers, kids arguing, dogs barking, everything. It was messy, funny, and very, very human. People who had only known the screaming singer suddenly met a man who couldn't work the remote control and kept muttering, "Sharon!" as his lifeline every time something went wrong. In one early episode, Ozzy wrestled with a broken television set, smacking the side of it while his kids rolled their eyes. In another, he tried to take out the trash, only to be mobbed by the family's pack of dogs. It looked more like a scripted sitcom than the father of heavy metal. The contrast was irresistible. The Prince of Darkness was also a confused dad, a husband who genuinely adored his wife, especially when he drove her mad. I got a little emotional. Even before the end, you could see it. Bands that once opened for him at Ozfest, Slipknot, System of a Down, Korn, they were now stadium headliners. They paused their own shows to thank him. Crowds chanted his name louder than the songs themselves. Everyone knew what it meant, even if nobody wanted to admit it. Ozzy passed away on July 22nd, 2025, at his home in Los Angeles, with Sharon and his children by his side. After decades of loud chaos, his final hours were quieter. Held together by family, his heart gave out. All right, this is the third time I've tried to read this. Let's see if I can get through it without crying like a little baby. His heart gave out, but theirs carried him through till the end. Tributes poured in from every corner of music. The legends he once inspired now called him their North Star. Everyone lit candles, blasted Crazy Train, and scrawled his name on posters and walls, just like teenagers had done 50 years earlier. His hometown bowed its head in mourning while the rest of the world raised the volume. His family and the musicians that were just like family gathered for the service. and fans filled the streets outside. They left flowers, handwritten notes, and worn-out Black Sabbath records at the gates. The city that once gave him his first cruel nickname now gave him his final honor. If you strip away all the noise, that's the story. Not just bats and doves, not just chaos and headlines. It's about a shy boy who got saddled with a cruel nickname, who struggled to read, who was beaten by teachers and hurt by other kids, who stumbled through jobs that broke him down until he found a sound unique enough to carry his pain and big enough to carry the world's. He became Ozzy because the world wouldn't let John survive on his own. And even after Black Sabbath broke up, Ozzy, kept Ozzy alive because millions of people needed that voice as much as he did. He built a genre out of riffs and nightmares, turned accidents into legend, outlived his worst scandals, and gave generations of misfits and outsiders an anthem to scream back at the world. That's why when the lights finally went out, the music didn't stop. It still rattles car stereos, shakes arenas, and whispers through headphones in bedrooms around the world. Because Ozzy Osbourne didn't just sing heavy metal. He created it. For 60 years, he carried the heavy metal torch to what it is today. Thank you, Ozzy. Rest in peace, my friend. Wow. That was awesome. Thank you, Valentina, for writing a wonderful script. If you like this video, please subscribe. There's going to be a ton more. If you think a friend would enjoy this podcast or video, please send it to them and leave me a review on whatever podcast thing. I guess that's a thing. If not, don't. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Oh, by the way, I have another channel. It's called The Cheap Audio Man. I talk about stereos and stuff. I'll put it in the description. Thanks for watching.